policy that hopefully will affect all 50 states, that is overriding the interests and desires of the citizens of an individual state who might not like the policy, or simply doing it in an efficient manner. So with that sort of summary, I think I want to start out with two provisions, because it's useful to talk about real things when we're talking about theoretical concepts. One you're very familiar with, and that's the Medical Marijuana Act. The other one is the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. The Montana Firearms Freedom Act was an act, a proposal, not carried, but Gary Markett's idea that we should be able to manufacture firearms within the state, have them identified as Montana firearms by a stamp on the weapon, and have them sold only within the state. That is, he's going, this is solely interstate activity. It's not interstate activity, it's not interstate commerce. And because it's solely interstate activity, and because we got a means to identify it as an interstate activity, and because I'm not going to sell my firearms to somebody right across the border in Idaho, I'm only going to sell it right here in Montana, no longer is Congress and the very popular Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in a position to tell me that I can't do this. So with those two things in mind, let's talk about those two provisions and how that plays into the Supremacy Clause, what sort of 10th Amendment arguments arise and how they tend to fall.
Well, this is kind of the problem with, well, it's a problem, but in rebuttal to Anthony, that idea that each one stays in their own bailiwick would be wonderful, but they don't. And medical marijuana is a really good example of that. Here you have, and this is falling right hot on the heels of the Raich case. Gonzalez versus Raich is a woman who was dying of cancer in California. She grew a medical marijuana plant in her own backyard for her own consumption, not for sale, not to be transported across state lines whatsoever. And under Lopez, she was fine. Because the Lopez court, in that case was a gun rights case. In that case, Scalia likes guns, so he voted with Thomas and said, you know, a majority, and said there has to be some kind of limitations on the commerce power. It can't just be wide open, otherwise it makes an absurdity. But in Raich, because he doesn't like pot, he voted along with the people on the court, most of them on the left, who like commerce powers, and he said Congress can regulate this possession of a plant she grew on her own backyard because it somehow affects the market in marijuana, the illegal black market in marijuana. And so they've opened the door wide back open to Wicker, the case from 1942, which said that even a farmer growing his own wheat for his own personal consumption has an impact on commerce to be regulated. So now Congress can make any law it wants to about anything. And look what happened to the people here in Montana. Medical marijuana providers now facing years in federal prison. They'd have been fine under Lopez. They're not under Raich. And why? Because of the drug war. And so, once again, I'm not talking about having the legislature of the state stand up in all cases. I'm talking about, as Madison said, in case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact. The Commerce Clause has been turned into an absurdity. It was never intended that Congress could have a plenary police power to make criminal laws about everything under the sun. The Bond case is a real good example of that absurdity. How could she possibly know she's in violation of some chemical warfare treaty that's been turned into a federal crime? So the medical marijuana case is a really good example. Of course, the Made in Montana gun bill is interesting too, but since Raich, what's the likelihood of that prevailing in the federal courts? If they can regulate the growing of a plant in your backyard for your own personal consumption, not for sale, what chances does a Montana gun manufacturer have?
Scalia likes guns.
You have to overturn Raich. So we'll go back and forth on Scalia as a new linchpin of what the Constitution means.
I want to remind you, jump in here anytime. So, yeah.
Now this is, because you sound like a very distinguished group of attorneys and professors and whatever else. I just took a case.
We are, yeah.
I just took a case to the United States Supreme Court. I actually saw Scalia argue on January 23rd on the Jones case, on the GPS tracking system.
Oh.
Now, what I wonder is, I took a securities case against the state of Utah for two financial planners in the Brock case, and I argued 6 violations under the United States Constitution, 29 under the Utah Constitution. And the way I argued it is that through the 9th and 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, because this was a 1983 civil rights case, that through incorporation, all those rights under the Utah Constitution would then be included in the 1983 civil rights provisions and protections. And they kept trying to, the courts kept trying to separate those two, you know, but if you look structurally at the way the United States in our history is, you had the 13 states that then came together, so they all had their constitutions, like you're saying with Jefferson, already had the Virginia model done, and the United States patterned that, so they already had those and incorporated them, I think, through the 9th and 10th Amendment to preserve their rights. And then you've got all the states like Montana and Utah and Wyoming, all the western states.
And so how did that go?
Well, what we did is we went up to the 10th Circuit and we got half remanded back down to the district. And that's the part where we're struggling with is the state, the federal court's trying to argue, the district court is trying to argue they don't have jurisdiction over our state constitutional claims, and should we take it into the state? But we're arguing through the 9th and 10th Amendment, through incorporation, that those then become part of the 1983 civil rights suit, and a lot of the provisions are the same in the, you know, and I would say if all rights that are not expressly listed, you know, belong to the federal government, are reserved for the states and for the people in the 9th Amendment, all unenumerated rights are reserved for the people, that then pulls it into the federal level, keeps it in the federal district court, giving them jurisdiction in 1983 civil rights is a federal question.
So Justice Johnstone, how do you rule on it?
I haven't read the briefs. So the 9th and 10th Amendment are primarily, and I think it really ties together well, matches with the preamble of the Bill of Rights, which is very important. I encourage people to read it, why it was passed. The Constitution wouldn't have gone through without the Bill of Rights. But the 9th and 10th Amendments primarily are rules of construction of the rest of the Constitution. I think that's what makes Bond interesting, and you should probably take a look. I can see now why you're interested in that case, because it provides an individual cause of action.
Just standing.
Or standing for purposes of that. And, you know, I mean, circling back to how these themes have come up in Montana, too, with the Montana Firearms Freedom Act and medical marijuana. You know, I sympathize with Stewart, but I think he proves my point. The federal government won in the Supreme Court in Raich.
Doesn't make it right.
Well, right. So people disagree about these things, but those disagreements in court will get you so far. And then it's up to we the people to act. The Constitution belongs to us, not to the Supreme Court. So, and again, you know, the Virginia resolutions were, and this goes to the Montana Firearms Freedom Act. It wasn't Virginia and Kentucky that pardoned those convicted of seditious libel. It was President Jefferson. President Jefferson was elected by the people of the United States through all of the states in the Electoral College. I think this goes to, I mean, the Montana Firearms Freedom Act, what these acts can do, and actually the Montana Firearms Freedom Act is a great example because it migrated to other states and became the Healthcare Freedom Act, some of the basis of the suits against the Affordable Care Act. Unfortunately, most of the states found that they didn't have standing. The courts said that they didn't, but it did start an important discussion about the limits on federal power. Again, where that's going to have bite broadly, and I think we've seen it, is in the political process and the values that we, the people of the United States, have and what limits we want our federal government to respect. Through all of these things, again, people disagree with the government's limits on these things. Very few of those disagreements are going to be resolved, finally, in the courts. Those disagreements are generally broadly going to be played out in politics. And I think to the extent we can see them play out in politics, that's great, and we're more likely to have more protective government, more protective of liberty to the extent we the people care about it. The courts, as I said, right, I think race proves the point. You may think it's wrong, but they lost. And so, and I think to expect that the U.S. Supreme Court, nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate, is going to take a sustainably strong view, ratcheting us back to pre-1937, is maybe unrealistic. I'd advise my clients to call their congressman rather than bring another case.
Let me just quickly rebut. I agree that politics can solve some problems. He's referring back to Jefferson's what's known as Revolution of 1800, where the Federalists were swept out of office. What Madison pointed out, there was a reason why they were swept out of office, because they could point to these gross violations of the Constitution, and the people then did know enough of their rights to sweep them out. But what do you do when you've got a Bush who violates the Constitution grossly, and then you turn around and replace him with an Obama who does the exact same thing, and in fact goes one better and starts to execute American citizens? He killed al-Awlaki and his teenage son by decree. He did one better than Bush. Yeah, Bush. So what do you do in that situation? So, I mean, certainly you can say, well, we have to rely on politics, but when you're being black-bagged in the middle of the night and disappeared, like in Pinochet's Chile, politics kind of break down. And then you wind up with a chilling effect. And I'm just worried about the erosion of our constitutional liberties to the point where that political check no longer is even there. And if it's just politics, we'd be like England. We have a parliament to make laws whenever it wants to. We have a constitution for a reason. And you can't just say the solution is only in politics.
No, and I haven't. Mr. Al-Awlaki's parents, as Niki knows, the ACLU brought a case on that. The D.C. Circuit dismissed that case.
Right, the law.
Well, and then my question would be, so what would be the alternative? What tools within its tool belt does a state have to be able to challenge some of these overreaches of federal power? And I think we have to acknowledge that there just are some limitations. I'm curious if you think there are things that the state could be doing additionally, such as the medical marijuana example. So Raich lost. The federal law is valid under Raich. The federal government, Congress, can regulate controlled substances. But the state can't then, and what part of what Raich is good for is that the state can't undo that. The state can't say, well, within the state of Montana, within the state of California, within the state of Washington, the federal law just ceases to exist. We here in Montana are bound by both sets of laws. What I think is still very important, where there is still a lot of power in the concept of state sovereignty, is that Montana doesn't have to pile on. Montana doesn't have to make marijuana use a state crime on top of it. Montanans don't want medical marijuana use to be criminalized. The state law is in a little bit of flux, but currently says that in many instances a patient can use medical marijuana and will not be prosecuted under state law. There is still some power to the concept of state sovereignty, and that the state gets to decide how to use its resources, how to use as the extent of its authority and its law. But we have to acknowledge that the state isn't able to tell the federal government that you can't make this illegal, except, within the confines of discussing what is